This episode is brought to you by the new novel A Slice of Mars by longtime Geek's Guide to the Galaxy listener Garrick Hachey. A Slice of Mars presents an optimistic vision of life on Mars and explores the day-to-day lives of regular people living in a future in which the workplace, the family, and adult friendships have all been radically changed by future technologies and speculative cultural shifts. Inspired by the speculative societies of books such as Infomocracy and The Left Hand of Darkness, A Slice of Mars explores topics such as transhumanism, biodiversity, automation, and universal basic income. And here's a description of the book. It says, Mars is a strange place these days. Corporate overlords, capitalism, and even aging are things of the past, on a planet increasingly brimming with biodiversity, yet pizzerias are in short supply. Siblings Het and San set out to change that. But a roboticist and a bureaucrat can't run a restaurant alone, so they bring on some help, a bioengineer, a communications scientist, and an unlikely grad student from Earth. Together, this gang of geeks will brave the fires of small business. But work is just a small part of life. People are complicated. Different brains, different wounds, different values, and one questionably tame wildcat will all collide as they try to grow and succeed together. What comes out of the oven in the end is anyone's guess. Perfect for fans of Legends and Lattes, the Wayfarer series, and the Cemeteries of Amalo, A Slice of Mars is the low-stakes, high-tech novel you've been looking for. So again, the author is Garrick Hachey, so that's Garrick, G-U-E-R-R-I-C, Hachey, H-A-C-H-E, and the book is called A Slice of Mars. All right, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 538 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories, which is available now on Amazon.com. We had a great conversation about the book back in episode 500, so definitely check that out if you missed it. And today on the show, we'll be discussing the recent book, The Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy 2022, which features 20 stories by authors such as Elizabeth Bear, Meg Ellison, Stephen Graham Jones, Nalo Hopkinson, Kelly Link, Karen Russell, Peng Shepard, and Catherine M. Valenti. And I'm joined by three guests. So first up, we've got our producer, John Joseph Adams. He's the editor of Lightspeed Magazine and the series editor of The Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, and he's also edited more than 30 other anthologies. His latest project is the anthology Lost Worlds and Mythological Kingdoms from Grim Oak Press. So, John, welcome back.
Always good to be here.
Then next up, we've got Rebecca Roanhorse, who served as guest editor for The Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy 2022. She's a New York Times bestseller, and a Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Award-winning author. She's written multiple short stories and 6 novels, including Trail of Lightning, Black Sun, and Star Wars Resistance Reborn. She's also written for Marvel Comics, for television, and has had projects options by Amazon Studios and AMC Studios. The Mirrored Heavens, the third book in her Between Earth and Sky trilogy, will be out in 2024. So, Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And also joining us today is P. Djèlí Clark. He's the author of the novel A Master of Djinn, and the award-winning and Hugo, Nebula, and Sturgeon-nominated author of the novellas Ring Shout, The Black God's Drums, and The Haunting of Tramcar 015. His short stories have appeared in online venues such as Tor.com, Heroic Fantasy Quarterly, and Beneath Useless Skies. And his story If the Martians Have Magic, which first appeared in Uncanny, was reprinted in The Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy 2022. So, Fenderson, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Okay, so let's start off with John. So, John, what was it like working on this year's volume of Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy?
Well, it was great as always. It's always very difficult to sort through all of the stories that are published over the course of a year and find the ones to end up putting on the list of top 80 that I give to the guest editor. And Rebecca was lovely to work with. We didn't know each other super well before this. So, I mean, we'd met and stuff and corresponded a few times and all that. But it was very cool to get to work with her in this level. And we got to do an event about this book in Chicago a couple months ago. It was quite a while ago now. I can't remember when it was, but that was fun to meet up in person and do an event, which I hadn't done at least in a long time since COVID and everything. So yeah, so that was fun. And I don't know, all of these kind of blend together. They're all kind of, the experience is all kind of the same doing them. It's always hard to pick. There's always a wealth of wonderful material. So it's hard to be more specific, but yeah.
So you want to say more about that event? So like, where was it and how many people showed up and stuff like that?
Yeah, it was in Chicago. Veronica Roth moderated it for us. I had edited her novels when I was running my novel imprint, so I was just like, hey, I want to hang out with you when I come to Chicago. So hey, how about you moderate this event while we're at it? So she did, and yeah, I don't know. There was about maybe, I don't know, like 30 or 40 people there, I think, maybe.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if you remember, Rebecca, if it was more or less than that, but it was at the American Writers Museum, which is actually a really cool place. If you're in Chicago, I think it is definitely worth checking out. They have like these different halls of like different halls where there's like exhibits, and like one of them was like a timeline of American writing, and so like they had like these different interactive exhibits where it's like, you could like turn a little thing on the wall, and it's like, and there might be like a little video screen on there, and then like it'll play a little something. So there was like one of those for Fahrenheit 451. There wasn't a ton of genre stuff in there, as you would expect for something that's covering everything in American writing, but it's a pretty cool place.
Yeah, that's cool. All right, so let's get Rebecca in here. So Rebecca, kind of, do you remember when John first contacted you about doing this Best American thing?
I don't actually. I'm sure it was an email. I'm sure John was like, "Hey, I'm doing this thing. Are you interested?" And of course, I was familiar with it. I've read the anthology before, and I know I did tell the story at the Chicago event, so I think it's okay to tell again. I had a story, a short story called "Welcome to Your Authentic Indian Experience," trademark. But I believe came out in 2017 and won the Hugo and the Nebula, and it did not make the cut for the Best American Science Fiction Fantasy of that year. And I gave John a lot of grief about it, and I think he remembers me because of that. And then he asked me, to do some other anthologies, and it never quite lined up with my schedule. But this one did. And so we had a chance to work together. And so that was very exciting. And of course, John is sort of a legend in the field. So the fact that our schedules could align and I could work on this, and that he thought, that I was worthy of the guest editor position, which has been quite illustrious. There's a lot of kind of big time writers who have done it, including N.K. Jemisin and Diana Gebelon, Veronica, of course, Carmen Maria Machado, Joe Hill. So to be asked to join that company, I felt that was pretty cool, and that he trusted my taste, which was extra cool. So I was happy to do it.
So what was it like having 80 short stories that you needed to read through and judge?
It was not bad because I love short science fiction and fantasy, so it was not a burden at all. And my remembrance is that I had plenty of time to do it, although, it could be a little bit like childbirth. You forget the pain of it and you say, hey, I could do that again. But, I didn't mind. I had actually been asked to judge a novel contest, which wanted me to read like 100 novels in like 3 months or something. And I was like, yeah, that's not going to happen. But this could happen. This was not, so bad. So I didn't mind it at all. And I love, the field, and I don't always get a chance to read all the new short fiction that's coming out in a year. I usually am more focused on reading the novels, although certainly not at that volume and in that, time frame. So this was a treat, actually. I was excited to do it.
So reading over those 80 stories, were there any particular, anything about them that jumped out at you, any themes or, anything like that?
Yeah, well, I think, I say in my introduction, these stories felt like a lot of them felt like COVID stories to me. We were still really in the midst of, sort of of COVID when people wrote these stories, certainly, and when I was reading them, I think we just come out the end, but certainly the lingering effects of isolation and lack of community and grief and loss and all of those things were still in the air, and I would even argue, still are. And so that certainly, I think, showed in those stories, and in certainly the stories that spoke to me.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned your introduction there. I thought it was interesting. You say that some of the fantasy stuff that you grew up with was like Susan Cooper's The Darkest Rising and the Dragonlance Chronicles and David Eddings. And I've never read Susan Cooper. I mean, I've heard she's really good. I was just actually reading this book called Imre's Laz. It's the collected letters of Roger Zelazny. Oh. And he just goes on and on about how much he loves Susan Cooper. So it was making me kind of interested maybe to check that out.
Yeah, I will be honest. I know it had a huge part in my childhood, but can I remember anything specific about it? Besides, I think that it was like super Welsh and they were little kids. And, I was a little Black and Native kid in Texas, like had nothing in common with these little white Welsh kids, but I adored it, and it was like this sort of like, opening into this magical realm and sort of, these heroic journeys and things like that. And so I just remember it having a great impact, but can I tell you anything about the story? No. I think there were cliffs. I feel like there were some cliffs and there was some danger and, things like that. However, the Dragonlance Chronicles, I could probably write you a master's thesis on. So I will not do that, but those will remain some of my favorites. I'm not sure how well they aged, but that doesn't really matter. They hit me at the right time and in the right period. They were great.
I know. Just forget it, guys. Let's stop this panel. Let's just play a D&D session right now.
No, let's just talk Dragonlance because
they just released the Dragonlance thing for 5th edition. Come on, let's go.
Who here remembers Sturm's sun shattering? Who remembers that line? Because that still gets me verklempt.
Oh, nice. Well, I was a Raceland fan, so, if you've read any of my, books later, you could see his influence in my work, so, for better or worse.
It's funny, I was at a convention years ago, and George R. R. Martin was on a panel, and he said, that he grew up reading, like, Robert E. Howard and stuff like that, and he says, I feel bad for people who grew up reading awful stuff like Dragonlance. And I was like, hey... Man, I like you say, I haven't gone back to it, so maybe it won't measure up to my memories. But man, my memories of those books are so great.
Exactly.
Everybody's nostalgic for what they're nostalgic for, is my opinion.
Good point. Yeah, definitely.
All right, but let's get Fenderson in here as well. So, Fenderson, tell us about how did you first? Do you remember how you first found out you were going to be included in Best American?
I want to say John told me.
Yeah, that is correct.
And I said, yay, that's great. And I was happy.
Do you want to say, so your story is called If the Martians Have Magic. Do you remember kind of how you came up with the idea and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think as I also say in the book, and that I like that little last part where we get to talk about our inspirations. I mean, I was just always a fan of War of the Worlds. I think I've seen probably every version of it that's existed, not because I was like a fanatic. I just watched them when they came on. And so, yes, I watched the old 1960s ones where the aliens were actually in flying crafts. Then I read the book and I found out, they're supposed to come out of the ground. And so it's supposed to be like, marching. And then I watched the Tom Cruise one, which I was probably one of the few people who can watch that movie over and over again, despite the young girl screaming a lot, which a lot of people said got on their nerves. Love that flick. And so I was always a fan of that. I would later find out about, that the story itself has these anti-colonial themes, or at least was talking about issues of colonialism. And somewhere in my mind, I don't know exactly where, I wanted to bring in Martians. And I said, hey, what if I brought in some other things too? And the next thing you know, I had Haitian voodoo and a world changed upside down by magic. And somehow that all came into a story.
So did you have to do any research for this story?
A little bit. I know I did some research. For instance, I knew some background on voodoo, but I wanted to make certain I got certain things right. So I did a little bit of research on that. I did some research on, just went to my book of mythologies and so forth to look up different ideas of folklore around the world. And then the rest really was a lot of, I read over War of the Worlds so I could remember the actual story because there have been so many versions of them. I wanted to have the version that H.G. Wells had written. So I went back and read that. I think that was the thing that I most focused on to try to understand what my Martians would be like. Then after that, it was just one of those stories that, the story has all forms of magic. It has harpies in it. There's a little odes to Neil Gaiman in there. I just kind of just let my imagination fly with it.
So what are the odes to Neil Gaiman?
I can't tell.
Okay.
What if Neil's listening?
You have to read it.
All right. So listeners, you just have to, there's a challenge for you.
Keep that as a mystery.
What those are. Yeah. You say in your note, you say, I tried not to concern myself with genre boundaries, alien invasion, Haitian Vodun, geopolitical intrigue, humanish rights. It's all in there because who says it can't be? So did you feel at all like any trepidation about like that this was going to be sort of too weird, or were you always confident that it would work?
Oh, I always think my stories are too weird. That's just normal. I always think this story is going to be weird because I throw in there what I want. And the more like people might think like, well, wait a minute, this is Martian invasion. What is a Haitian Vodun priest doing in there? The more people I know that people might think that's a little weird, the more I want to do it. And so at the end of the day, I'm never hesitant in doing it, but I always do wonder, are people going to get this or just going to be too weird? But I do it anyway.
So what kind of a response have you gotten to the story?
Again, I'm always surprised. I'm always like, you like this weird story? Okay. So I've gotten actually great reception from it. Not only is it being featured here, but it was nominated. It was shortlisted. It was nominated, won a Night Award. And so I'm really happy at the reception. I tell this to writers. I said, there's always that story and you're wondering, should I put it out there or not? Opt for putting it out there.
Yeah. So you said you went back and reread H.G. Wells after, I guess, a long time. Was it pretty much the way you remembered it, or was it different than kind of how it existed in your memory? Like the Dragonlance book?
Yeah. I think it was different only because I've also been influenced by so many different War of the Worlds I've seen, versions of it, that it was hard to separate those from the ones he had written. Right? Like the fact that a lot of it's set in England and I've seen War of the Worlds and they're set everywhere. Right. And so it was kind of re-remembering in a way the story I'd read long ago, but it was refreshing.
Mm-hmm. Well, so how about Rebecca? Do you remember reading If the Martians Have Magic? Do you have anything that sticks out in your mind from that story?
Oh, well, okay. So I am a big Fenderson fan, as he knows. And he has a pretty distinctive style and a pretty distinctive world building. So while the stories do come to me anonymously, sometimes you pick up on things and you're like, I wonder, either this is Fenderson or this is a Fenderson stan, working really hard to write like he does. And so I was immediately enthralled. Like, I too watched the Tom Cruise version of War of the Worlds, although I don't know if I watched it multiple times, although I do know my husband has. But anyway, and so, sort of familiar with certainly the milieu and sort of what you're expecting. But to see it in Fenderson's world and to see the different sort of entities at the table and all the sort of politics that are happening, behind the scenes and everything are the things that I really loved about it. I think his world building is so rich and it's so unique. And so I was immediately drawn in. And I'm always I'm always inspired by how much someone like Fenderson can do, how much world building they can do in so few words, and the world that they sort of create, and all these things that you feel, are sort of the foundations of the world that he doesn't even have to show you, but that you can sort of extrapolate, from what's sort of going on the surface. I thought was very successful. So I loved it from the get-go. I knew that was one of the best stories in the bunch.
Mm-hmm. So is that an experience you had over and over, that you sort of had an inkling of who might have written the stories, or was that sort of unique to Fenderson, that you kind of knew who had a strong sense of who it might be?
No, that was pretty unique. Most of the time I did not. There are certain people that have distinctive voices where you're like, this sounds like a XYZ, sort of story. But, I didn't make decisions based on that. I made decisions based on the quality of the work. But I think probably I would say Fenderson and probably Stephen Graham Jones has a really distinct voice. I was like, this sounds like a Stephen Graham Jones story. That one is the Kid in the Arcade. I was a teenage space jockey.
Yeah.
And so, I didn't know, there's no telling, but I did sort of feel some vindication when I did see, who it was that had written it. I was like, aha, I thought so.
Mm-hmm. So how about John? Is there anything you want to add about If the Martians Have Magic?
I think everybody covered anything that I would have added, but I think the idea of being able to pick up a writer's style by just reading the stories anonymously, I think that speaks so highly to the quality of the writer that it's like a really big compliment, whenever you can do that. I haven't had the opportunity to read many stories anonymously, just because of the way I work. But like one story that I did read anonymously at one point when I was working at FNSF was I'd read a Neil Gaiman story that had been submitted that Gordon had just asked me to read, and Neil didn't have his name on the front of the page like he did. He's Neil Gaiman. He doesn't follow a standard manuscript. he puts his name where he wants to, which in this case was at the end of the story. So anyway, I was reading the story and I didn't know who it was. And it was just like, oh man, this is so good, and it was just like, I couldn't quite figure out who it was. I mean, I knew it was like somebody like Neil Gaiman, but I didn't really pinpoint that it was him. So I'm always fascinated when people can actually read stories and figure it out, and who the writer is without knowing that it was by them. And then, but like I said, I mean, I think it just speaks so highly of the writers. I would have guessed that Kelly Link would have been in that realm too, just because she is very distinct, although she does have a lot of, emulators out there. But
yeah. And I will say for me, this was my first Kelly Link story.
Oh,
so
okay.
I was not familiar with her the way that I am with Fenderson and Stevens. There you go. But obviously I loved her story. Wow.
Yeah, that's such a great story. Yeah, I like when I revisited that. I revisited a bunch of the stories ahead of that Chicago event, and it was like it hit me all over again. It's like, oh man, I forgot how great this story is.
Yeah, well, so the Kelly Link story in this book, it's called Skinder's Veil, and the basic setup is that there's this flailing grad student, and a friend of his is house sitting this house in sort of like remote Vermont or something. And she has a family emergency and asks if he can cover for her. And she gives him, and so he agrees and goes out to this house. And she gives him these directions that the guy who owns the house, he has a lot of friends who stop by. And if they show up at the back door, he should let them in and just let them hang out, do whatever they want. But the owner might show up and he will come to the front door, and under no circumstances are you to let him into his own house. So it's this very, very odd, intriguing setup, and that was really, hitting me reading it. When you create a mystery like this, like why can't you let the owner into his own house? It just makes you want to read the story so much and find out what's going on with this whole mystery thing.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, you.
I was just going to say that I definitely that tension. I love tension in a story, but I'm also like a big chicken, and so tension makes me really uncomfortable. But I love when authors can do it, when they sort of create a situation where you've got to read to the end to find out what happened. moments, and you're just on, sort of on the edge of your seat going, oh my gosh, please don't mess this up, protagonist. Please, bad things are going to happen. And even in that story, when the character's going through and sort of whether or not they're going to let people into the house or not let people in the house, the mix of fairy tale. I'm not a huge European fairy tale fan, but the way that Kelly was able to bring some of those elements in, I thought was really masterful and really unusual. I hadn't quite seen it that way before. And so, yeah, I felt that story was really successful on a lot of fronts, what she was doing. I was really impressed.
And like, I've read a lot of Kelly's work, and so like I know that she always does this, but just I was kind of struck by like how just wonderfully written it was. Like, like I said, I would expect that from Kelly Link, but this seemed like it was almost at another level even for her, where I just felt like I was completely spellbound by the entire story. So it was really something.
I was also, just speaking of Kelly Link, I was really struck by her author's note where she says that for the last 7 years or so, I've been wrestling with an extremely long novel, which is now more or less finished. I didn't know if we were ever going to see a Kelly Link novel, so that was kind of exciting to me to see that she's apparently basically done with one.
Yeah, wow. So hopefully that's very true and not just like the almost part is the thing we should focus on.
Yeah. I also thought it was cool. She says that, her usual work process is that she'll, go to a coffee shop and meet up with a friend and who's also a writer, and they'll just hang out and write all afternoon or whatever. And also she'll arrange these, for a bunch of people to all have like a write-in in the house or something, for the week or whatever. So, and that she wasn't able to do that during COVID. It kind of disrupted her usual routine, but I thought that was cool. I mean, I don't usually ever do anything like that, except I guess at like Clarion or something like that. But I hope someone will invite me to something like that. Sounds like fun. How about Fenderson? Did you ever go to any? Do you ever write with other writers around, or is it all solitary?
No, I'm mostly a solitary writer. I'm never around enough people who are writing for that to happen. I mean, there are a lot of plans. We talk a lot, like, yeah, we're going to do this, that, and the third, and it never works out. I write when I can. Is it 2 a.m? Is it my daughter's asleep? Great, I can write now. So I try to snatch a bit of writing whenever I'm able.
And you have 2 small children, right? So
yeah, and they've arrived, and I've just told everyone keep them downstairs. Otherwise, this recording will be something else. Just tell my wife to please keep them downstairs for a second. I was going to say on that story everybody was talking about, Skinder's Veil. Yeah, that was a trippy story, and I guess I related to it on several levels. One, I was once a grad student. And so trying to finish a dissertation, so it took me back to a lot of places, and the struggle was real. But the whole notion of like the house, I mean, first of all, the story is hilarious. And so as much as there's this fairy tale, there's this deadpan way of writing where a lot of the times I'm just laughing by the way the story is narrated, right? And when he's going on about his roommate and the sex constantly, it's humorous. and I remember having roommates and that kind of thing that you're out of now, but there's a time in your life when that has to happen. And so the story itself, the whole time, I'm like, where is this going? And I have to know where it's going. It was like the one story, like I kept, like every time I had to stop it, I was like, I have to go back because I have to figure out where the story is going and what's going to happen here. But yeah, the tension of the rule. I mean, even before the rules, by the time I got to the rules, I was hooked. And you just knew that at some point, I'm not trying to give it away, you just knew at some point, okay, I know how stories go. Those rules are going to have to be confronted, right? Especially the last rule about never letting the owner in. You know they're going to have to be confronted. And I think it's like Rebecca, you were saying, talking about the tension. I was like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? What's he going to do? Because the character is so... He does things that you don't like. You're like, dude, get it together, right? He looks like the character who's just going to do the wrong thing, and it can go anywhere with this guy. And so, no, it was a really delightful read. And I mean, without giving it away, the way the story, I mean, it just, like you said, a lot of the fairy tale elements. I don't want to give it, there's a bear, folks. There's a bear in it. There's a bear. It's just something else. The whole time I'm reading it, I'm just thinking like, person who wrote this, the imagination has to be just out of control. Like, no, I was really impressed by that story.
Yeah, no, I just loved it. I mean, I had to stop about, I don't know, 2/3, 3/4 of the way through, and I actually went out and I told my girlfriend I summarized the whole plot for her. You know, I was just like, you know, you got to hear this about the story I'm reading. It's so cool. So yeah, no, I thought it was really, really like so well done. I just really, really, really loved it. Rebecca, you also mentioned the Stephen Graham Jones story, which was another one of my favorite stories in the book. It's called "I Was a Teenage Space Jockey." Do you want to just talk a little bit about that story?
Yeah. So Stephen Graham Jones, he usually writes horror, but I don't think I would put this one in the horror category. This is almost more of a coming of age moment. There's a boy whose older brother is no longer in the picture, and the only memory he really has of him is that he set the high score on the arcade game where they would both go and like play arcade games and stuff. So this is in the age of arcades as well, and so sort of in a expression of grief and a way to sort of reach out to his brother, he goes and tries to set the high score on this arcade game. And things that you don't expect to happen, and there's some danger, and there's older kids, and things like that. So I don't want to say what happens, but I thought it was just really touching and really moving. And there were, a few moments where I was just sort of like, oh, my heart.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't, I wouldn't call it like a traditional horror story. It was maybe like a little bit more of like a Ray Bradbury kind of horror story, like Something Wicked This Way Comes or something, where it sort of has the sort of darker aspects to it, but not, there's not like, blood spilling, brains
Right.
splattering anything like that. So John, any thoughts on I Was a Teenage Space Jockey?
Yeah, I mean, I love that story. Obviously, I also published it in Lightspeed first, so it was one of those where it's like, it's always all the Lightspeed stories are always fighting against each other because it's like I love them all, of course. So it's like trying to pick your favorite child or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I was very excited to get that story and glad that it got the kind of reception that it did. I mean, it got a lot of nice reviews, and I can't remember if it got reprinted in any other volumes, but I mean, I was very gratified to see it at least resonate with Rebecca. So and end up in the book.
Yeah, well, because I mean, I always want, because it's like Rebecca said, it's sort of set in the 80s during the heyday of the video arcades where, it was a little bit dangerous. The older kids might beat you up and steal your quarters and stuff like that. And it, it references, very specifically all these specific arcade games like Galaxian and stuff like that. And I always kind of wonder, like I grew up with all those games, so I know exactly what he's talking about. But I wonder like how different the experience is of someone who doesn't know any of those games. Like, I just kind of wonder what it's like, what do they picture when they hear the name Galaxian and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it must be like reading a science fiction story, where it's like, hey, there's a bunch of made up stuff in here and I can kind of picture what they're talking about, but not really.
Yeah. Fenderson, do you have anything you want to add?
It must hit a little different if you know the games. And I did, because I grew up in the 80s with them as well. And yeah, that was a great part of that story. I was like, oh yeah, Galaga, I remember these.
Yeah, and Galaga, for the record, is my game, man. So just even as recently as like 2 years ago, I think I spent like 3 hours playing Galaga. So yes, I consider myself pretty good. So I really loved it.
Was that in an arcade, or like where did you play it?
Yeah, actually it was on this is so random, but it was on the Jockey cruise. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's like this science fiction fantasy cruise, and they set up an arcade on the ship.
Of course they did,
and, you know, it's open, you know, so you can go play as long as you want. So I think I spent like we would go pretty constantly, but I think I spent an entire afternoon there just playing Collect. So.
Yeah, like the video arcades have kind of made a little bit of a comeback. I mean, like when I lived in New York, there's a place called Barcade where you can go, and here in Austin, there's a place called Cidercade. So it's kind of like,
nice.
You know, you can get alcohol and play old arcade games. And now, you know, I don't have to worry. Well, I have to worry less about being beaten up by bullies, I guess. And you know, I can pretty much have as many quarters as I want. So,
yeah.
You know.
Nice.
See, Fenderson, do you have any arcade memories or anything like from? Did you ever have to dodge bullies or anything? Like that?
Oh yeah, I remember Tempest. Anybody remember Tempest?
Oh yes,
yeah. I used to play the heck out of Tempest. Used to play Centipede, where that ball would get caught on your palm. So yeah, I remember. I mean, I grew up in the '80s, so I remember a lot of it. Heck. I mean, what's funny, the whole time I'm reading Steven's story, I'm also thinking of The Last Starfighter, because so much of it is based on anybody who grew up in the 80s with arcade games, right? And so, yeah, I was at the arcade. Now, I didn't have the bully problem. Like, bullies didn't last long in my neighborhood. That's all I got to say. You didn't last long if you were a bully in my neighborhood. That wasn't going to happen. So there wasn't a pecking order like that. It was going to be rough on you if you decided, I'm going to take up the occupation of bully. So that was stuff that I would see on TV. And I'd be like, look at these bullies. These are interesting creatures. So, yeah, but I mean, I do remember going to arcade, having to have all the quarters, or when they would make you, for some reason, change your quarters to those annoying coins. And yeah.
Oh, yes. Tokens.
That was the life. Yeah, that was the life back in the day. So the story, it did hit with me in thinking about all those games again, and you know, trying to get your name up on the game, right, to get the high score. That was that was fun times.
Yeah, and like how that seemed like, you know, an achievement, like it's like a sort of a little slice of fame, even if it was only there for a week. But you know, wow, if you got like the top score, you got to put your initials in for like a couple of months, and every time you'd go back, you check to see if your name was there. So, you know, I think that speaks also to what makes a story successful. Is it so evocative, you know? And I'm always impressed. Again, you know, I said this before, but when people can do that in very few words, you know, and like evoke all these memories for different people, because we probably all are very different people with very different, you know, sort of lives. You know, that's amazing. That's successful. And so even more than the sort of fantastic elements or something, there's this ability to tap into like what it is to be human. And that's, you know, sort of what I'm looking for in a story too. I think that's great.
Yeah, well, speaking of memories, I thought it was interesting that in this book there are two stories that deal with the theme of memory erasure. And this is a theme that's near and dear to my heart. One of my first big publications was about erasing painful memories. And so I'm trying to find my note here. What were the titles of the stories? One was
Delete Your First Memory for Free.
Yeah, Delete Your First Memory for Free. And was it The Algorithm Will See You Now? Was that the other one? Or yeah. So yeah, I always like to see the theme of memory erasure. Actually, you know, my cousin was doing a little movie based on my story, but then Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind came out. And I kind of
about to mention that,
kind of nixed that. But yeah, so Fenderson, you want to jump in there? Like, what do you think of this idea of memory erasure in science fiction?
It's always fascinating, right? And I think what I love so much about this notion of delete your first memory for free was that, okay, here's normally memory deletion is seen as terrible, right? You're losing a part of yourself. And so it was interesting seeing that story, how it could be for good in some cases. And so really like that story, as well as the Algorithm Will See You Now was just such a human story. It was like, and I love speculative fiction stories that are so wedded to, when I read something and it's just wedded to real life, like you really get into the characters and you see this couple going through things, and this person, the main character who is a psychiatrist, and dealing with their patient, and how there's issues of loss in there, and how all of that is also interwoven with this futurist element and the notion of memory erasure, and how it dealt with issues of trauma as well as disability. It was just such a well-written story. That one stayed with me for a while.
Yeah, what do you think about that, John? Because I also and because I had this story, I sort of had my antennas up for other memory erasure stories my whole life, basically, and like Fenderson is saying, I can't think of one necessarily other than this one, Erase Your First Memory for Free, that treats memory erasure as basically just a good thing. You know, like I think the sort of natural way for the story to go is to have this theme, like if you erase your mistakes and erase your pain, then you're erasing yourself and what makes you human and what makes you an individual and everything. So it was kind of a novel treatment to just have the idea, like, oh, maybe it would just be good, if you could. But are you in agreement with me there that you can't think of another story that's taken that exact tack?
Yeah, nothing leaps immediately to mind. I mean, I suppose it's possible I did delete that memory at some point. But, no, I mean, I was kind of thinking when we started talking about this that it's like, well, I have selective memory deletion when it comes to like stories and things. So it's like these panels are hard for me because it's like I just read like 1,000 other stories for this year's volume, and I'm supposed to remember the stuff that I did last year. I've read so many stories since then. I have to like selectively erase my story synopses memories to keep my brain clear to be able to process the new things that I'm reading. But no, yeah, I can't think of anything. Yeah, I mean, that actually kind of seems like that would be a good anthology theme, just because it does come up so much in across a variety of like it shows up in all media, like in TV shows and movies and stuff. And so I think that could work. We could find out for sure if there is another one out there. But yeah, that's I can't think of one.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone listening knows of one, let us know, because I can't think of any. Rebecca, is there anything you want to add on this whole subject of erasing memories?
Oh, I guess just to echo that. That's what I think made that story stand out, that Delete Your First Memory for Free. I think it's sort of deceptively simple, sort of slice of life. I think at first glance, people might be like, I don't get it. How is this one of the best stories of the year or something? But I think because it does sort of bring up, like, what if our brains are the enemy? Like, what if, it would be okay to get rid of a few memories? Certainly I could relate to that. And I think, especially in this day and age, we've all said or done something, that we wish we could remove. And what if we could just remove that? It's not that we're losing ourselves; it's that we're gaining our better selves. And I thought that was very, very compelling. And like everyone said, I don't think I'd seen that before. And plus, it is also a very sweet story. I think it sort of has sort of a gentleness about it. That I thought was great and that really appealed to me.
We've all said things we regret, usually on Twitter.
Yeah, right? So what if you could just delete that whole memory from the collective consciousness? That would be great.
Fortunately, when we say things we regret on the podcast, Dave can just edit it out. And then only us 3 people know, or 4 people, yeah. But before we move on...
Sounds like you erased your memory of one of the panelists.
Yeah, right. Before, I wasn't counting myself when I said it. But, before we move on from this, one fun administrative note, the algorithm will see you now. It appeared in an anthology called Vital, which is like a sort of future of healthcare anthology. And when I saw that it had come out, like I'd heard about this anthology and I saw it finally come out, I looked it up and I'm like, on Amazon, like I could see like Amazon's just easy to find where the pub date of something is. And so I looked there and I found it and it was like December 31st. Are you kidding me? Like this book came out on the last day of the year. Are you serious? And so I was like just double checking. I'm like, is that real? Because sometimes things get added in Amazon and it's like not the official pub date, And so I'm like, okay, well, this is important. Like, did it publish on January 1st? Or because like publishing on December 31st is a weird time. And turned out it was. So he made it right under the wire there. And ended up in the book. So that was pretty cool.
Huh. Yeah, I wonder if there's some story behind how does seem sort of like an odd date to release a book on.
I mean, it's a small press. yeah. It's a small press, and like I don't know if when they did that, if they realized what they were doing by releasing it literally on the last day of the year, just because of like award eligibility reasons, and for instance, for this, like I could have easily missed it. So I'm glad it didn't. Obviously,
maybe they're just hoping to appeal to all the people who just get drunk on New Year's Eve and go buy science fiction anthologies.
Yeah. Well, it's like they drank so much on New Year's Eve that they're going to need to figure out some inventive solutions to healthcare. It's like to keep living, I guess.
So I want to get Fenderson back in here. So were there any other stories in the book that you had anything you wanted to talk about on, or that stick out in your mind, or anything like that?
I mean, my turn to talk about things that stuck out. So, first of all, the book starting off with a story set in Trinidad was something close to my own heart. When with the Sukiant in it by that is 10 Steps to a Whole New You by Tanya LeBird was a pleasant surprise to see that story in there. Love that story. Well done. Some other stories that stick out to me. The Cold Calculations was this trippy story, because on the one hand, it's about this spaceship pilot and, the stowaway and the good old thing of physics, and we've got to get rid of these things. But then it takes you to all of these other places and time and space, and then they all come together. So that one was one of those stories that stayed with me as well. Trying to think of some others. We already went through Skinder's Veil, of course.
Well, actually, while you think about that, I'll jump in on the Cold Calculations. Was this story called?
The Cold Calculations.
It's a it's a play. There's a famous story from the 50s by Tom Godwin called The Cold Equations, where the premise is that there's a spaceship and it has to get to this colony to deliver badly needed medicine or vaccine or something. And there's a stowaway on board, and that's going to cause the ship to not reach its destination. And so the pilot has to throw the stowaway out of the ship to for the greater good. And there's like it's been a story that's been much discussed in science fiction. And there's this long history of critiques of, is the situation contrived, or, and so on. But just to set that up, if anyone doesn't know. So Rebecca, do you have any thoughts on The Cold Calculations, or like, what did you think when you first read it?
Well, so I wasn't familiar with the classic story. I think John brought that up too when we did our event, and I was like, well, there you go. So clearly I'm not familiar with most of like classic science fiction. I am a Dragonlance reader. Thank you. So I thought that was, very compelling, obviously, the situation. And then the sort of interweaving, what Fenderson sort of alludes to, this interweaving of other stories where people had to make, difficult decisions and things like that. I thought it was great. Very emotional, very well written. And the fact that I like, even though I didn't realize it at the time, I really like this idea that it's in dialogue with a classic science fiction story. I love seeing that. I think there should be more of that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see people responding to it positively in that way. Like, both people who do know the story, and then people who didn't know the story. And actually, when I came to it, being familiar with the original story or the Godwin story, like, and knowing, like Dave was saying, like a lot of people have written these sort of responses to that story, or like discussed it, at length. But so then coming to it is like, oh, another story in dialogue with the Cold Equations. Okay. And so it was like, I wasn't really expecting it to be like, to like knock my socks off and be like, oh yeah, what's going in the book now? So well done to Amy Ogden. I thought I had read enough of those in dialogue with Godwin stories, but apparently I need at least one more. So
that's a fascinating idea to me, though. Like like I was saying, like people reading the Stephen Graham Jones story without having played those specific arcade games. The idea of reading this story without knowing about the cold equations. That's really interesting to me. I hadn't thought about that, but that must be a much different experience.
Yeah, actually.
Yeah, now I definitely.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, now I just want to go back and read it too. I'm really interested.
I think it's still on Lightspeed. We had reprinted it at some point, the original story, and because one of the early stories we published was a story called The Old Equations, which was only kind of in dialogue with it. It wasn't like Amy's story is definitely like hardcore in dialogue with that story. The Old Equations was kind of like riffing on the Cold Equations, and so, but we reprinted it back then, and So I think it is still up on the website, but anyway.
Yeah, and if it's not, I mean, I forget if it was Escape Pod or Drabblecast or something did it, and I remember it being quite good, their production of it. So I'm sure you could find that as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to Fenderson. So have you thought of any other stories that you think we should touch on here?
I'll just bring up a few. Let me see. What did I like? I'll just go through one I liked. The Frankly Impossible Weight of Han was just a fascinating story. It's one of those stories where the world building, the speculative aspect of it was amazing. There is science, and I loved it, by the way, because I like a story that breaks genres. There's science in here. There are gods. There's everything that you can possibly want. Really great story.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like yours in a way, where you have this sort of classic science fiction setup and then, bend the genre to make it, like fantasy or whatever. I mean, the premise basically is that this scientist has invented a duplicating machine, and then the duplicating machine starts duplicating itself, and this causes a sort of worldwide crisis, and definitely goes in these sort of supernatural directions that I wasn't necessarily expecting. See, John, do you remember anything you wanted that you could say about that story?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I thought it was really interesting what it does. But what you're saying about the different genre elements, it's stories like that and like Fenderson's story, that also do that like really makes me frustrated at the whole sort of codified science fiction slots and fantasy slots that I've done to myself in both Best American and in Lightspeed. Like I have to label something one or the other, and it's like just because of the way the magazine and then the book is structured, and because it was like we want it to be equally appealing to both people who say they like science fiction and people who say they like fantasy, and so we want to have it 50-50. But then there's these stories that are like, well, but these are touching on both things. These could be either or both, and so like how do you count those when you're cramming them into slots, and so like it just gets frustrating sometimes,
So how did you count like Fenderson's story?
I think so. Fenderson's story was fantasy as far as where we're counting, and they were both fantasy. Because I think I can't remember my exact thought process at the time, but I mean, when I think about it in general, like a little drop of fantasy in a story that's like otherwise entirely science fiction kind of makes it fantasy. It's like the fantasy's so powerful. There's so much powerful magic in that drop of fantasy that it turns the whole story. Because it's like once you have because science fiction is supposed to be like speculative and theoretically like possible based on existing actual scientific knowledge and all that kind of stuff. And so when you drop in something that's like, okay, well this part's magic. Then it kind of makes everything is sort of touched by this fantasy. So I guess that's a lot of pedantic sort of arguments I get into in my head. But
can I ask a question?
Yeah.
John, were there any stories that stumped you? Because I'm thinking of one that kind of stumped me because I was trying to place it myself.
What stumped you as far as which genre it is?
Was our good old Cold Calculations.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, I called it science fiction. Just I again, I can't remember if I what
it gets interactive at one point, and yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I probably defaulted to that one because of the cold equations, it being in dialogue with that and everything. And so a lot of times it's like I just go with what like the overall feel to it to me feels like.
Yeah. Well, that's like George R. R. Martin's furniture thing. That if it's got
the
robots
furniture,
and spaceships, it's science fiction.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. What is that? I'm not familiar with it.
Oh, George R. R. Martin has this sort of mini lecture that he gives sometimes where he says that people have all these, thoughtful, philosophical, complicated theories about what makes something science fiction or fantasy, but that really what it boils down to is fairly superficial aspects of the presentation. Like if there are robots and spaceships, then it's science fiction, and if there are dragons and unicorns, then it's fantasy, and all the stuff about the scientific worldview and stuff doesn't really matter most of the time for how people actually categorize things in practice.
Yeah.
Interesting. So the age-old question is, what is Star Wars?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and then
it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, and then you get into science fantasy, and then there's a whole other argument. Yeah, I had a story that I published in Lightspeed. I can't remember which year it was, but it was so science fantasy, and it was like, I think it was like 14,000 words or something. So it was like longer than we usually publish. And so I decided I was going to do a 2-part serial, right? And so since I have those slots, I took I published the first slot and I called it science fiction, and then the second slot, or the second part of it, when we ran it, I put it in the fantasy slot. So I'm like, all right, well, okay. I'm not making any judgment calls on what genre that story is, except that it's clearly both.
Actually, so speaking of magic, I actually had some quotes here that kind of makes me think of. So, actually, I should have written down which story this was from. But one of these excellent stories in this book contains this quote. Later, this was the last forest on Earth story.
The
Future
Penguin
Library.
Shepherd story. Yeah, Future Library, right?
Future Library, yeah. The narrator says, later I learned it was that way with writers, that everything seemed like fate or magic to them, and it was always totally normal. So there was that, and then I had another quote I was going to connect with that. But it's in my notes somewhere. But basically, it says that people become writers because they think that they can save the world, and so. I was just curious, since we have a bunch of writers here. I was curious. Do you think that that writers think that they can save? That people become writers because they think they can save the world? And is writing just sort of feel like magic to writers? And that's just part of the thing. So Rebecca, do you have any response to either of those things?
Well, my first response is I think I became a writer because I was hoping I could save myself. I had much smaller goals in mind. And it's not magic. It's hard work. It's exculpatory. It's bleeding on the page. I know that's a little trite to say, but for me, it's definitely true. So I don't know who these writers are that are conjuring words and not extracting them from their flesh, but they're not me. And certainly, while I hope that my writing makes a difference, particularly in the expansion of genre and like what it means to write fantasy and who gets to be in a fantasy story and what the nature of sort of heroes and villains and all of those things are. Those are the things I like to interrogate. Hopefully that may change the genre world, but I'm not aiming so high as to change the actual world. No.
Because I mean, I definitely was in that camp when I was younger, that I honestly thought I could change the world by writing. And my ambitions have contracted somewhat since then. Now I just want to get a novel done and keep in touch with my friends. But I don't know, Fenderson, did you ever feel like your writing could save the world? Is that part of why you got into it?
I think I came to writing too late. It had all been leached out of me. When I was younger, I thought hip hop was
Exactly.
going to save the world. Okay, I thought Public Enemy was going to save the world, and De La Soul, but that didn't happen. I think by the time I came to writing, I was probably a bit more clear-eyed, but I certainly did, and I still do want my writing to inform. So I want to, of course, entertain and tell a great story, but I also hope that my stories say something meaningful to people, that it reaches people in a meaningful way, that I pull on aspects of history. I'd love as an educator, I'd love people to go back and I want to know more about that and research things. And so, yeah, I think I write with a type of purpose, which of course, again, is first and foremost to give people a great story. But, I also want to talk about things that I think aren't talked about enough and show people who I think don't appear enough and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, actually, on that subject specifically, so there were two stories in the book that I wanted to highlight. So it's the Kat Valenti story and the Carolyn Yoakum story. Both kind of deal with female protagonists who feel ignored or invisible because of being women. So in the Yoakum story, there's a quote where she says, or no, sorry. No, sorry. This is from her in her author's note. She says, "It is about marginalized voices for all of us who have ever been told that our art is too complicated or confusing simply because it comes from our perspective. It is about the struggle to be seen and remembered." And then in the Kat Valenti note, she says, and yet I could never shake the feelings that this whole story was about no one asking a woman what she actually wanted over and over again until she died of it. So Rebecca, do you want to jump in on that? Did you sort of did you notice that theme sort of running through some of these stories?
Yes, perhaps. I don't know. So I think the Valenti story, I loved that, L'Esprit d'Escalier, which is sort of not quite a retelling of Orpheus and Eurydice, but maybe sort of and then sort of a contemporary reframing of the story, which I thought was just wonderful. And certainly it does. The focus is on Eurydice and sort of what happens to her, and let's say Orpheus is successful in like bringing her back, and then what does her life sort of look like? And it's sort of this suburban malaise. But with like sort of fashionable hipster people, So I thought it was very creative. It was very cool. I'm not super big on retellings, but I thought this one was really excellent. And so, yes, I guess to your themes, I'm not. I would have to. I don't know. I think sometimes when I'm writing, I'm not going, "Oh, this is a feminist, sort of take on this," or "Oh, this is," like. If the story is successful, then that comes through in a way that feels organic. So I don't like things that are like forced, even though those are big issues that I feel are like sort of important, and I want to see, sort of the female perspective on this or something like that. It has to feel organic to the story, and I think, for example, Catherine's story is super successful at doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just the scene in the story where, so it's sort of like Orpheus is a rock star and Eurydice's father, Apollo, is a rock star. And just the scene where Apollo comes and like unexpectedly crashes at their place. And I thought it was just such a well done melding of the Greek mythology and the rock star lifestyle kind of stuff. It felt very authentic.
And
I believe that she's... Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say in voice, like voice, like that's, for me, in a story, like voice is so important. And she just really nails like sort of the voice of capturing this, sort of, I guess, hipstery feel, everything from like tense to word choice it's a very masterful story. Like, I think if you take it down to the sentence level, I think it's doing a lot of work. It's really interesting to me.
Yeah, and the Yoakum story too. It starts out among impressionist painters in France, and it seems like she had done a ton of research on that. I mean, I really felt like that showed through in that story. Fenderson, do you have anything you want to add about either of those stories?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those stories were fascinating to me. I mean, I think first I'll go with any story that retells Greek mythology. I always love, and so what was interesting in that story was, I mean, I've seen the story of Orpheus redone many times, but I thought the way of having Orpheus this time portrayed as like a real jerk. That what he's doing, like, you like me for doing this, aren't I great that I've done this? I think it really got at the heart. You know, it's like when you've read these stories many times and something was always a bit off about it, and there it was, right? That Orpheus is this really self-centered person who believes that what he's doing for everyone else, but it's just for his own self. And then, like, you know, attaching that to music and rock star, for you guys who haven't read this story, the appearance of Apollo is going to be hilarious. So Apollo and his crew is going to be pretty funny. And so I really like that story. I mean, I always like Catherine's stories, and I like that different take on mythology. So yeah. And the other story had its own, who's arrived? Oh, the dog has arrived. I was like, somebody's opening my door. The dog knows how to open doors now. So you just push open the door. And so, yeah, I'm going to stop there because I've lost my train of thought because the dog arrived.
Well, I'll say, I mean, just also speaking of rock stars, I also wanted to mention the Sam J. Miller story. It's called Let All the Children Boogie, which I guess is a line from the song Starman by David Bowie. And Sam says in his author's note that he's writing a series of 5 stories, and all the titles are drawn from his 5 favorite songs. So he has other ones he's published called It Was Saturday Night, I Guess That Makes It All Right, and A Love That Burns, Hot Enough to Last. And I was curious, John, about this because, you know, back when I was a young writer, they always told you don't quote song lyrics. The record labels are litigious and you have to pay tons of money if you quote anybody's lyrics. And so
right.
I don't want to get Sam in trouble here, but I was just wondering, like, is that not true, or like how is
no?
Is
it is true. It's just that how much of it counts as fair use is a very sort of fluid and debatable topic. Like I wouldn't dare to offer any legal advice, although Rebecca's a lawyer, so maybe she can. But I know for that that the publisher did go through a bunch of stuff with Sam to make sure that it was clear legally for the title to use that, and for what I can't remember how much if any more of the lyrics are quoted in the story than just that. But
I think there's 3 lines in the body of the story.
Okay. Yeah. I don't remember the details. I feel like he may have when we reprinted it may have like cut 1 or 2 of the lines from when it originally appeared or something, because I think the legal department at the publisher was like, that's too much. But it is complicated enough in general. It seems like to me that I understand why people would still to this day advise people not do it. But sometimes it just feels like it's necessary. And in Sam's case, it's like obviously these songs all very much inspired him and to write these stories in the first place. It's a tricky situation, tricky waters to navigate.
I mean, Rebecca, do you have anything to add on that, or just the story in general?
Yeah, nothing from the legal perspective. I wasn't that kind of lawyer, but I love the story. That was another one I thought that had an emotional punch that really worked for me, and I love just that feeling. I feel like that story really captures that sort of nebulous time in adolescence where you're trying to figure out who you are, and everything feels sticky and new, and music is like a bomb in your life. Fenderson said, he thought that Public Enemy would change the world. I think that's a very sort of a feel you have in adolescence. That's like, these songs are so emotionally profound for me because I'm trying to find words to figure out who I am and what is my identity. And these artists seem to have some sort of insight into life that you don't have as a teenager. And so I thought this story was very effective. I thought it was very, very cool, just capturing sort of that moment in time and what that feels like. and how intense that, friendship can be, or that budding romance can be, and how someone like David Bowie, of all people, can can capture that in a way that you yourself cannot articulate.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about this, but it's kind of similar to the Stephen Graham Jones story in the sense of, recapturing this like pre-internet sort of world of, record stores. And, I think they drive like half an hour to like a Strawberries or something in the story to try to see, to get their hands on one song that they have no way of possibly obtaining otherwise.
Yeah, so remember what that's like? Obviously the young people won't, but I was even talking to my daughter, and I was trying to explain to her, what before we had streaming music, you'd have to sit with your, boombox, and you'd have your, cassette tape ready, and as soon as the radio song came on, you hit, record, and then you didn't know and you didn't know what song was going to be next. You just had to get lucky, and she was just looking at me like I was crazy. Like, what the heck? This is no way to live. But, that's just the emotion of that, and how exciting.
Struggle was real.
Mixtapes, how the struggle was real, and the mixtapes, and how, that really, expressed an emotion, that you couldn't, articulate yourself. You gave that to somebody you liked or something, and it was a big deal. That's the sort of thing that story evokes.
Yeah, well, because I was going to say, there's a moment in Sam's story where the character, hears this song on the radio that she just loves, and just experiences this like existential despair when she realizes that, she can still sort of hum the melody, but doesn't know any of the lyrics, doesn't know the artist or anything, and has no idea if she'll ever be able to find this song again in her life, and it's kind of what things were like back then.
Yeah.
Is there anything, we're running a little short on time here. Were there any other stories or any topics or anything that anyone wanted to make sure that we get to before we run out of time?
I wanted to mention Root Rot by Fargo Tabaki. It is a wonderful story about a man who is part of a colony on Mars where they've sort of set up. He's Palestinian, I believe, and they set up like an Arab quarter on Mars. And he is sick, and he is dying, and he is an alcoholic. But his family has never quite given up on him, and they come looking for him. And it is this emotionally devastating story about choices that people make and loss. But it's not hopeless. There is, hope, if not for the main character, then for the next generation. And it's just beautifully written. And I was not familiar with his work, so that was a real pleasure to find sort of this diamond in the rough, I felt. Although he could be famous and I could just be ignorant of his work. But I thought that it was really beautiful. And I think that is the story of all the stories in the book that at the end I was sort of like sobbing. I was like, oh my God, this story is like, just a stab through the chest, but in like the best way. So I would definitely recommend people make sure that you don't miss Root Rot. I think it's the last story in the collection.
I just emailed, I don't know if John, if you saw my email, there's a moment in the story where the main character is going through some sort of checkpoint.
Oh, yeah.
And they extract a pint of blood from him, and then he walks along and they return his pint of blood to him. And I thought that was such a striking image. I'm not sure exactly. I was asking John, do you understand exactly why they're doing this? Or I don't know if anyone can explain that. But I thought it was cool regardless.
Yeah. I don't remember it well enough to say now because I didn't have a chance to reread it right before the panel. But yeah, I agree that's a really interesting detail. But yeah, I don't recall.
Fenderson, any thoughts on Root Rot?
No, I think Rebecca said all. Really powerful story where it's basically a story of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but taken to another world, and this individual. Dealing with his own alcoholism and just other mistakes he's made in life. It's just really, I think it was a great story, by the way, to end on. Right? Just a very emotional story to end on.
Thank you.
Yeah. So no, I thought that was a great one to bookend the anthology on.
Yeah, it was actually fun choosing. John and I worked together to sort of choose the order of the stories. And, you mentioned the Tanya Libbard story, 10 Steps to a Whole New You, that opens. And that is told in, sort of patois and, part English, part patois, like that sort of thing. And I chose that story to open the collection because I wanted that to feel like this is not your father's science fiction and fantasy collection. I wanted that to be a real punch in the face, which I think she does both stylistically and structurally. I think it's very creative. And I wanted to end with Root Rot because I thought that that's the like hefty, emotional story. And I don't think after you finish that story, I don't think you're like, oh, well, let's go on to the next one. I think you have to let that one sit a little bit. And you're probably like, let me put this book down because I need to go, sort of contemplate my life. And so choices like that were a lot of fun. And like, it's really interesting to sort of put stories together. I even put the Stephen Graham Jones and the Sam Miller story next to each other because they both have those sort of teenage 80s feel to them. So I'm glad, you picked up on that as well. So yeah.
All right. So I guess we'll just have time. I just want to mention one more story, The Cloud Lake Unicorn by Karen Russell. And just the reason I want to mention this is because she says in her author's note that she's always wanted to write a unicorn story ever since watching the cartoon, The Last Unicorn, as a kid. And that was one of my favorite movies growing up. And I tried to get John to watch it, and he was insufficiently impressed by it.
I'd seen it already. I was resisting rewatching it. That fucking butterfly, man! I can't get past.
Yeah, I remember you hated the butterfly. Yeah. But I just feel like I really stuck it to John, or that the fact that this loving reference to The Last Unicorn is in his anthology, and there's nothing he can do about it.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, man, I appreciate The Last Unicorn for what it is. I just, I loved it back in the day, and then just like on rewatch, I found a lot more complaints. But I should try it now because, as our friend Doug had noted one time on the podcast, like I used to hate everything, and then now I like things. It's weird. It's like I like when we review a TV show or a movie, it's like, wait a minute, John's the one that likes it. What's going on? So I'm getting soft in my old age.
Yeah.
But I mean, someone needs to tell Karen, like, look, girl, like, you're Karen Russell. You can write whatever the hell you want. Like, you want to put unicorns in it, you do it. You want to put some dragons in there, go for it. Like, come on. How famous do you have to get before you can just do whatever you want?
But we are pretty much out of time. So I think we're going to have to go into some final thoughts. So Rebecca, any final thoughts on this whole experience of guest editing Best American Fantasy and Science Fiction?
Just that it was a real joy. I loved discovering all of these stories and all of these authors, many who were new to me, and some who were perennial favorites, like Fenderson. And John is an absolute delight to work with. So thank you again for inviting me to do this, John. It was great. And we've continued to work together on future projects, which is just an extra little bonus. But, now that I've gone through the experience, I think that I will definitely be picking up the anthology every year because I'm very excited to see what the next guest editor is going to do. And I'm excited to see what people are writing and where the genre is going. And what sort of new voices can be discovered and how far we can push boundaries and still tell universal stories.
Yeah, absolutely. So Fenderson, final thoughts.
Yeah, so I'm delighted to be in the anthology. These are one great thing about sitting down and reading this is that all the stories are going to be good. Not because of the names there, but like, okay, it's the best. So you don't have to worry, read an anthology, like, these are going to be great stories. Like every story in here, we didn't have time to talk about each one, but every story in here is a great story. Some stuck with me more than others, but I think I'll still remember most of them. I want to thank Rebecca for blindly choosing me, even though you might have thought it was me. Thank you, Scott, for including me in this group, especially again for a story that I wasn't certain I was ever even going to publish. So it's great to be in here, and I hope that people enjoy these stories that are all very different, even if you can compare a few. Like there are two stories in here with Patois, the other one by Nalo Hopkinson, and they're two completely different stories. You'll also read a story about a pizza boy that we never got to discuss, but it's a pizza boy, literally, in space.
Amazing, right?
Yeah.
Like, who would have thought?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a terrific story by Meg Ellison. And Fenderson, sounds like you might need to go. So definitely let's wrap this up. But John, final thoughts, and just what is the future of this Best American series?
So and I just wanted to echo all the all the things Rebecca was saying, but like, for her, like I feel the same. Like we're on the same wavelength there. It was lovely working with her and all of that. And the future of the series, it looks good. HarperCollins bought Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, which was the original publisher, and seems like they're very much behind it and everything, and it seems like there's no sign of it stopping anytime soon. So we'll keep proceeding on. We do have the next guest editor lined up. I'm not sure if we're supposed to say who it is yet, so I will refrain. But there's a bunch of other cool things in the works on my end. So as Rebecca alluded to, secret things that we are not allowed to talk about. But maybe soon. But yeah.
All right, cool. Yeah, and it sounds like you're sort of you're right in the midst of doing the next one as we speak.
Yeah. I owe the last batch of stories to the guest editor like very soon. So yeah.
All right. Well, we'll let you go so you can get back to that. So let's wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with John Joseph Adams, Rebecca Roanhorse, and P. Djèlí Clark. So thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Always good to be here.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to John Joseph Adams, Rebecca Roanhorse, and P. Djèlí Clark for joining us on the show. This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy was made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And remember to check out the new novel A Slice of Mars by longtime Geek's Guide to the Galaxy listener Garrett Cachet. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.